It's been a while since I've been able to make video content for this channel, and so I thought that today, since I had the opportunity, I would continue what I've been doing on the Substack, which is really a lot of book reviews. I've been reading a lot, trying to just familiarize myself with the different ideas and the issues that are connected to the whole issue of masculinity and men and their work and everything that goes with that. And of course, the natural tendency for a lot of men is to follow the path of least resistance. And, that's epitomized in the kind of character of the kid eating Cheetos in his parents' basement, playing video games, etc. Um, and of course, there's not a strong motivating factor to get that kid out of there. And the what was the primary motivating factor for most of history was the need to become married, to find a woman to support and to start a family. And of course, there's a lot of problems with just kind of getting that going today. Um, but we've gotten into that situation because people have followed advice that seemed smart on paper, or they've kind of taken hold of some ideas without really following the natural consequences of what happens. And so I'm going to talk today about a book here. It's called Men in Marriage by George Gilder. And this book was originally published 50 years ago under the name Sexual Suicide. And then he revised a lot of his arguments and things in like 1986, where it was retitled Men in Marriage. And he was writing in response to the earlier feminist movements, and kind of exposing a lot of their ideas, and showing that really it's women's liberation was women fighting against their own best interests in the long run. And the people who have benefited off of it, which he really predicted at the time, and 50 years since, it's really just gone to show, proven correct, is that the people that benefited most off of the women's liberation was wealthy and successful men. Because in a open marketplace, where people are free to do as they please, they have the most power and opportunity to attract young women. And so he begins the book, he frames it in the context of a parable. And he talks about first scenario is about this princess who encounters this barbarian out in the woods. And he's desiring for her to go back to his cave with him, and she has no interest in doing that. But she basically sets some rules and parameters and circumstances whereby, through effort of reforming himself, cleaning himself up, becoming productive and presentable, he's able to court the princess and become a valuable member of the kingdom, and eventually inherit the kingdom as the husband of the princess. And then to contrast that, it goes into like a later scenario where they have a daughter. So this other princess meets a barbarian, but instead of causing him to have this reforming act by putting demands on him, she just readily goes. This is a free love scenario. They enjoy their time in the cave or whatever. There's no strings attached. But of course, what happens is then a wealthy guy comes from another kingdom and says, "I'm going to leave my wife and I'm going to take you with me." And she says, "Okay." And then what happens is the barbarian just says, "Well, where did the princess go?" And then subsequently, as new barbarians spring up in the woods, there are no princesses for them to seek after. There's no driving need to become responsible men, and the kingdom is basically lost through their overwhelming presence. So there's a little bit of pushback when this book first came out, and I wrote another blog about it because it seems like he's kind of saying like men are just incorrigible barbarians and they need women to civilize them. And I think there is a certain truth to that, and this is what people give pushback because they're saying that this is maybe against some of the things the Bible says. But I mean, if of course, maturation is not simply the effect of woman on man; it's a product of age as well. But it's the application of goals at a certain time that really motivates people to mature and become the kind of people that they're supposed to be. So it's a give and take, between the man and the woman, and that's really what marriage is about. But what he goes over in the book is how kind of the feminist movement, this push for equality in all things, it's benefited women who are more or less able to fill a lot of the roles of modern society, but it's taken away the unique roles of men. And it's reduced men's responsibility, which reduces their motivation. And it really, now we're at the point where we can see that there's a crisis of masculinity. And we don't know what we're doing. The previous generations kind of waded through these waters and didn't think about how the continued change was going to affect the next generation and how they passed on that knowledge of what it means to be a man. So this book, a lot of the information in here, 50 years on, it's amazingly relevant. He basically touches on every problem that we are dealing with in our society today. Maybe not as explicitly, like things have gone a lot past what he predicted they would in some areas, but there's not really any areas that he didn't anticipate. Like for instance, he didn't really talk about like transgenderism, but he talks about this kind of desire for the woman to become more masculinized and the men to become more feminized, and these are all symptoms of the breakdown of marriage and family. One thing that I really think reflects, especially as I've interacted with some negative reviews to the book, is that we have accepted a really weak definition of what sex is. Essentially, to take the materialistic view, where we just think of sex as like the act of sex itself, or as he says, copulation, and we've accepted that definition and tried to apply it. And so, like he talks about that the prime factor in life is the sexual superiority of women. But basically, what he's saying is that all men contribute to the act of sex is the moment of copulation, the deposit of genetic material, whereas sex really encompasses all the differences between men and women. And the trade-offs are that women are superior sexually because they can raise life, they can nourish life, they can produce a source of food, and beyond carrying a baby to term, they really have a lot more of a biologically important function. The man does not have to be present for the survival of the species, except in that brief moment. Of course, there's trade-offs. Men have a greater ability to protect and provide, and so the great thing about marriage is that the different trade-offs are best utilized, where the support that the woman provides allows the man to produce culture, environment, and really build a society. And that's kind of the tagline of the book, It says civilization is built by men with families to feed, because without that impulse, and without the man's name being tied to the children, um, he's going to be a wanderer. He's just going to go about. He's not going to be welcome into a lot of places. And the unfortunate thing is that in, we sort of act like that's what men want. Well, that's just kind of the only option that they have in a lot of ways, or that's by far the easier path for them to follow in this day and age. At a different time, when we had more broadly accepted monogamous marriage as a lifetime institution, as the norm for society, that really had a vast impact on what a man would plan to do with his life. Now we've gotten to a point where it's a risky proposition for a lot of men because they're put in the more vulnerable position. It's really the woman has the freedom to leave at any time, the freedom to take the children, and mostly the freedom to take the man's resources at any time. So this is the problem that we're in, But of course, there's no way through that problem except for men and women to begin to rely on each other again. So that's a conscious choice that they have to make. But he really gives a good evidence of how like feminist ideas and these things have filtered down and caused us to be in the place that we're in. So he talks about the need for men to be married. It's the only way that we can have a connection to the future, because a woman, there's no questions about the maternity of a child. The woman bears the child. That's her child. But it's really only if she's willing to acknowledge the man that the man's name will be carried on. So men that do not father children languish in obscurity and disappear over the course of history. Unless if they do some great deed. But the great deeds are usually done by men with families. That's the truly lasting work. You think about like a hero who will die in combat to save his fellow soldiers. Those men will remember him, but his legacy doesn't really live on, except through those other men. So since the book was first written, marriage has definitely disintegrated a lot more, and there's some really interesting interviews you can watch on YouTube. Like there's one where he's on Donahue, and there's an older one where he's on the Dick Cavett show after the first book came out. And people, it's just funny to hear people, because he'll say a general thing and people will just say, well, I have an exception to that general principle, so I can ignore it. But that's, of course, not the way that arguments work. We have to look at the general principles. There's always going to be exceptions, but the general principle is what has the long-term outcome. He touches on a lot of different things, like about the increase of homosexuality, and that really, I don't know if he gave a lot of sources necessarily. I think he did, but through the historical view, that was something that was more often than not a phase for men, because the understanding was that to become mature means marriage and family, and it means putting aside that sort of lifestyle. But of course, by promoting that to a legitimate identity, there's no incentive for men to move beyond it. And of course, he also touches on the fact that a lot of homosexual identity, it comes from a place where there was some sort of interaction during the formative years or during the teen years, or sometime there's usually some impetus either in childhood or adolescence that puts people on a path of curiosity towards exploring that, which is like a taboo thing to say. You're not allowed to say that because we just want to believe that people are born the way that they're born. But evidence says if that's the case, it's an extremely rare thing because the prevalence of some sort of abuse or encounter or exposure is so much higher in people that seek after a homosexual lifestyle. So, and now we're broadcasting it all over the place. So, um, obviously, the number of people who resonate with that will grow the more that they are told that it's a good alternative lifestyle. He also speaks about some of the dangers of reproductive technology. In many ways, it could already completely eliminate men. Men could be reduced to sperm donors, and women can conceive without ever seeing a physical man. He goes on, eventually what's going to happen is gene editing will be part of this, and artificial wombs. And when we get to that point, then scientists are in control of the future of the human race, basically, and that's probably not a good thing because it's going to mean the state will be the arbiter of what lives are desirable to be created. But he also goes on a lot of really good information about things like the importance of career and how necessary that is for the man. But it is really an interrelated thing with his marital status because a married man is much more willing to sacrifice his leisure time to go be a productive member of society. That's the ground from which the truly creative ideas come forth. And if you look up George Gilder and see about some of the other books he's written, he's really treated a whole lot of subjects around this thing. But interestingly enough, he says that this is the central thing, is this, the man's connection to his family that drives all the rest of it. But he's got a lot of really interesting books about economics and information theory, and I think his most recent one is called Life After Capitalism. So he really goes into an information theory of wealth that goes beyond the sort of the weakness of the capitalist idea is that it's based on greed. And what he actually says is that it's actually based on altruism because the investor must give away his wealth in order to create more wealth. And it's a risk because he has to anticipate the needs and the desires of others in the marketplace in order to be profitable. I think that's a very interesting point of view. And he's connected to the Discovery Institute, which has the intelligent design aspect in one part, but the other part's kind of a think tank, and they're connected to this kind of superabundance theory that really seems like it has a lot to it. It just goes contrary to a lot of the people who would benefit from stuff like climate hysteria. So if you want a more positive outlook on life overall, he's got a lot of interesting stuff to look into. But yeah, he makes a really, really clear case for what the importance of the man to have a career, to be a provider, and what a beneficial thing that is for all of society. And he shows that when that's taken away, what results is a welfare state. And interestingly, he kind of notes that really the only truly matriarchal society we've ever had is in the inner city ghettos where basically the women are married to the state and the mothers as recipients of the subsidies kind of have this matriarchal system. But obviously it creates women after its own kind, so the women are learning to get pregnant at a young age because there's actually overwhelming benefit to having all your bills provided for because you are bearing children, but not to get married because then that reduces the benefits. And what basically happens for the men is that the men leave. Even if they're in a relationship, or eventually they will leave because they get into this place where it's counterproductive. It's counterproductive to actually be officially married. So maybe you just live with somebody, but then it's counterproductive for you to work because you can just live off of the welfare that the woman's earning, and so it just really it just doesn't produce. It's a negative economy in a sense. And of course, the only thing it really creates is greater and greater dependence on the state. And he knows a lot about these various topics and how they fit together. I'd say like most of the time, if you have a Christian book on like family and marriage and things like that, it's going to talk about like how a husband should behave towards his wife and towards his children. But what he sees by having the knowledge of economics and government policy and technology and innovation and all these things is that these are very powerful forces that really dictate what happens with the family, and we're kind of blind to it a lot of the time. Like, and we are just left to wonder, like, why don't people choose to be married anymore? But so much of society has made it very difficult to be married. You're going against the stream by choosing to have a married lifestyle, and even though it's ultimately the most beneficial for people as individuals and certainly for children to be raised in that environment, we're kind of blind to the way that like government policies and economic decisions and things like that actually affect our ability to do that. So he's advocating for like, well, we got to switch this thing around where like the benefits are going towards people who are married and having children rather than incentivizing single people to have children and to not get married, which I think would probably have a big impact on things, or at the very least, it would allow the people who are advocating for this normal, traditional lifestyle to be able to have a bigger voice and a bigger influence because they wouldn't be so consumed with having to just provide. It would be a huge benefit to somebody like me, where we're always having to make trade-offs about how the choices we make with our money, and rather than earning more money that would probably help us out, I'm choosing to spend some time on projects like this because I think ultimately in the long run it's good and beneficial and hopefully should benefit our family, but because it's so important to try to change the culture that we're in, because if we don't try to change it, we're just going to be dominated by it. But in order to change it, we need to be aware of all the different forces that have an impact on what happens. And so I highly recommend that you read this book, and there's a lot of really interesting information in there that would benefit anybody who's interested in these subjects. So thank you for watching.